3,000 Jewish children vanished from the face of Nazi-occupied Europe. They weren't deported. They weren't found in concentration camps. They simply evaporated. And the most unlikely place on earth became the perfect hiding spot. A small Protestant village in the heart of occupied France, where pastors and farmers transformed their homes, barns, and schools into underground sanctuaries. But here's the detail that will make you question everything you know about World War II. These children weren't hidden in secret basement or distant forests. They walked the streets. They attended classes. They played in public squares. And the Nazis, with all their surveillance machinery and terror, never found them. How is it possible to hide 3,000 lives in plain sight? The answer lies in Chambon-sur-Lignon, and the story you're about to discover was deliberately erased from history books for decades. It was the year 1940. France had fallen. The Nazi swastika hung over Paris, and the collaborationist Vichy regime turned southern France into a hunting ground. Jews were registered, marked, torn from their homes, and shipped eastward in cattle cars. Children were separated from their parents at the gates of WWII, the transit camp on the outskirts of Paris, where entire families awaited their death sentences. The terror was methodical. The Nazi machine was efficient. And in the middle of this hell, there was Chambon, an isolated village of 5,000 inhabitants perched on the WWII plateau at 3,000 ft above sea level. It was cold, it was poor, and it was Protestant. That last detail matters more than you think. Lyon was inhabited by Huguenots, descendants of French Protestants who had been persecuted, tortured, and massacred by the Catholic monarchy for centuries. They knew the taste of persecution. Their own family histories were marked by midnight escapes, hideouts in caves, and the memory of ancestors burned alive for their faith. When the Nazis rose to power and began hunting Jews, the people of Lyon didn't see strangers. They saw themselves 300 years ago, and they made a decision. They wouldn't stand by and watch. Not this time. It all started with one man, André Trocmé, the pastor of the local Reformed church. Tall with round glasses and a firm voice, Trocmé wasn't a conventional war hero. He was a committed pacifist, influenced by Gandhi's teachings and the theology of nonviolence. But in June of 1942, when the Vichy government began demanding that pastors read anti-Semitic decrees from the pulpit, Trocmé did something extraordinary. He refused. And from the pulpit of his modest stone church, he declared that his congregation had a duty to hide, protect, and save anyone persecuted by the regime. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a moral command. And his village, remarkably, obeyed. But here's what makes this story different from any other resistance story you've ever heard. It wasn't a secret operation led by an elite few. It was a mass conspiracy. Farmers, teachers, housewives, children, everyone knew, everyone participated, and everyone kept the secret. When the first Jewish child arrived in the village, knocking on a farmhouse door in the middle of the night, the farmer's wife didn't hesitate. She took her in. Days later, 2 more arrived, then 5, then 10, and then, like a silent, unstoppable river, they kept coming. Children whose parents had been arrested. Children who had escaped from trains. Children whose identities were erased and rewritten on false baptism certificates. And last Chambon became something impossible, a sanctuary in plain sight. The question you must be asking yourself now is, how did they pull it off? How did an entire village conspire against the Third Reich without being destroyed? The answer will surprise you, because it involves something the Nazis never understood. The silent strength of ordinary people who decided that some lines cannot be crossed. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly how they did it and why this story was almost erased forever. The system worked like this. Word spread through underground networks. A Jewish family in Lyon, desperate and hunted, would hear a whisper from a sympathetic shopkeeper or a resistant contact. Go to Chambon. Ask for the pastor. They will help you. No addresses, no guarantees, just faith in strangers. And so they came on foot, by train, hidden in the backs of trucks. They arrived at night, exhausted, terrified, clutching forged papers, or nothing at all. And the doors of Chambon opened. Not just one door, dozens of them. The village had no central command post, No sophisticated intelligence operation. What it had was something far more powerful, a shared moral certainty. Every household became a cell in an invisible network. And the most extraordinary part, no one was forced to participate. They simply chose to. André Trauma and his wife Magda became the quiet coordinators of this impossible operation. Their parsonage turned into a clearinghouse for human lives. Magda would answer the door at all hours, greeting exhausted refugees with a phrase that became legendary. Naturally, come in. Not maybe, not we'll see what we can do. Just naturally, as if sheltering the persecuted was the most obvious thing in the world. She would feed them, find them temporary beds, and then within hours or days distribute them across the village and surrounding farms. Some children stayed with families. Others were placed in boarding schools that dotted the plateau. The schools run by Protestant educators became fortresses of false identities. Jewish children were given new names, taught Christian prayers, and blended into classrooms alongside local kids. Teachers knew, students knew, and no one talked. But the danger was constant and suffocating. Chambon sat in Vichy, France, which meant it was under the control of the collaborationist government that eagerly enforced Nazi racial laws. The Gestapo operated freely. Informants were everywhere. The village police chief, a man named Robert Bach, could have destroyed the entire operation with a single phone call. But he didn't. He became part of the conspiracy. When orders came down from regional authorities to round up Jews, Buck would forget to execute them. When SS officers arrived to inspect the village, he would somehow fail to find anyone suspicious. And when warnings came that raids were imminent, he would quietly pass the word to Trome, who would activate the alarm system the village had developed. A coded message whispered from door to door, farm to farm. Within minutes, children would scatter into the surrounding forests, hiding in prearranged spots until the danger passed. The first major test came in August of 1942. Vichy authorities, under pressure from Berlin, launched a massive roundup of foreign Jews across the unoccupied zone. Thousands were arrested, families were shattered, and then the orders reached Chambon. Regional prefects demanded that Trauma provide a list of all Jews sheltered in the village. It was a death warrant disguised as paperwork. Trauma's response was simple and devastating. We do not know what a Jew is. We only know men. He refused to provide any names. It was an act of open defiance that should have resulted in his immediate arrest and execution. But something unexpected happened. The authorities hesitated. Why? Because El Chambon wasn't acting alone anymore. The conspiracy had grown beyond the village borders. Surrounding towns and farms across the plateau had joined the network. Protestant communities in nearby Lumas-Fuino and tents opened their doors. Catholic families inspired by the Protestants' courage began sheltering refugees as well. What started as one pastor's moral stand had metastasized into a regional uprising of decency, and the Vichy government, terrified of igniting a broader revolt in a region already suspicious of central authority, backed down for now. But the Nazis weren't blind, and they weren't patient. By the winter of 1942, whispers about Léon had reached the highest levels of the SS command structure in France. Something was wrong in that mountain village. Too many refugees were disappearing into the plateau. Too many Jewish children were slipping through their fingers. And so in February of 1943, the Gestapo made its move. A team of officers arrived unannounced, led by a captain named Julius Schmeling. They came with trucks, dogs, and a mandate. Find the Jews, arrest the conspirators, and make an example of this village that dared to defy the Reich. The entire operation should have taken hours. It took weeks, and it ended in failure. Schmeling wasn't a fool. He understood that Chambon was hiding something, but he couldn't prove it. The children he encountered on the streets all had papers. The families hosting them all had explanations. This is my niece from Léon. These are cousins from Marseille. The stories were rehearsed simple and impossible to disprove without extensive background checks that would take months. And here's where the villagers' strategy revealed its genius. They never denied anything outright. They simply buried the truth under layers of mundane normalcy. When Gestapo officers searched homes, they found children doing homework. When they inspected schools, they found students reciting Protestant hymns. Everything looked ordinary. Everything felt wrong. But Schmaling had no evidence. And without evidence, even the Gestapo couldn't act freely in Vichy territory without risking a diplomatic incident with the collaborationist government. The closest the Nazis came to cracking the network happened on a freezing morning in late February. Schmaling's men raided a boarding school called Maison d'Osia, a 3-story building perched on the edge of the village. They burst through the doors demanding to see identity papers for every student. The headmaster, a wiry man named Daniel Traum, André's cousin, calmly complied. He produced documents for every child. The officers examined them closely, looking for inconsistencies, forged stamps, anything that would give them grounds for arrest, and they found nothing. But as they prepared to leave, one officer noticed something odd. A boy in the corner, no more than 12 years old, was clutching a book to his chest with white knuckles. The officer barked an order. "Show me the book." The boy hesitated. The room went silent. Daniel Traum stepped forward. He smiled, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and explained that the child was simply protective of his prayer book, a gift from his late mother. The officer wasn't buying it. He ripped the book from the boy's hands and opened it. And there, tucked between the pages, was a photograph, a family photograph. And the boy in the picture was standing beneath a menorah, clearly celebrating Hanukkah. The officer's eyes lit up with triumph. He had his proof. He grabbed the boy by the arm and began dragging him toward the door. The other children watched in frozen horror. And then Daniel Traum did something that should have gotten him executed on the spot. He physically blocked the doorway. He told the officer that if the boy was to be arrested, he would have to arrest Daniel as well because this child, he declared, was under his protection, and Daniel would not abandon him. The standoff lasted less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The officer could have shot Daniel where he stood. He had every legal right under Nazi occupation law, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the cold certainty in Daniel's eyes. Maybe it was the realization that executing a school headmaster in front of dozens of witnesses would turn the entire plateau into an active resistance zone. Or maybe, just maybe, even a Gestapo officer retained a sliver of humanity that recoiled at murdering a man for protecting a child. Whatever the reason, the officer released the boy, shoved Daniel aside, and stormed out. But Daniel Traum's name was added to a list. And 6 months later, the Gestapo would come for him. The children, meanwhile, learned to live double lives. By day, they were Marie, Pierre, Jean, good Protestant children with baptism certificates and rehearsed family histories. By night, in whispered conversations in attics and barns, they were Rachel, David, Sarah, holding on to fragments of their true identities like precious stones. They learned which prayers to recite in public and which ones to whisper in private. They memorized the names of fictional relatives and the details of towns they'd never visited. And they learned the most important lesson of all: silence. A single slip, a single moment of confusion could unravel everything. The weight of that responsibility on children as young as 5 years old is almost unimaginable. Yet they carried it because they understood even at that age that their survival depended on a perfect performance. The village children became their co-conspirators. Protestant kids who had grown up hearing stories of their own ancestors' persecution understood instinctively what was at stake. They covered for the Jewish children when their accents slipped. They helped them memorize Christian rituals. They lied to their own relatives when necessary. And they formed genuine friendships that transcended the terror of the moment. There are accounts of local boys teaching refugee children how to ski, how to milk cows, how to navigate the mountain paths that could serve as escape routes if the Gestapo returned. These weren't acts of pity. They were acts of solidarity. The children of Léonong didn't see victims. They saw friends who happened to need protection. And in that simple reframing, they became part of the most effective resistance cell in occupied France. The network expanded in ways that defied logic. Farmers in the surrounding hills began forging documents in their kitchens. A local printer named Oskar Rosowski, himself a Jewish refugee barely 18 years old, became a master forger, producing hundreds of fake identity cards, ration books, and baptism certificates that were so convincing they fooled even Gestapo document specialists. He worked out of a cramped attic room using stolen official stamps and homemade inks mixed from berries and chemicals smuggled from Leon. Every document he created was a lifeline, and every day he worked, he risked a firing squad. But he kept working because in last Chambon, everyone contributed. There were no passengers, only crew. Food became another act of resistance. The plateau was poor, the soil was rocky, and wartime rationing meant that even the locals barely had enough to eat. Yet somehow, the village fed 3,000 extra mouths. Farmers diverted portions of their harvests. Women stretched soups and stews with whatever they could scavenge. Black market networks, typically reserved for profit, were repurposed for survival. And the children, both local and refugee, were taught to forage in the forests, gathering mushrooms, berries, chestnuts, anything edible. Hunger was constant, but starvation was avoided. It was a logistical miracle performed by people who had no training in logistics, no resources, and no margin for error. They simply refused to let the children die. And through it all, the Nazis kept searching. Raids became routine. Gestapo officers would sweep through the village at random intervals, searching homes, interrogating families, trying to catch someone in a lie. But the lies held, the system held, and every time the officers left empty-handed, the conspiracy grew bolder. By the spring of 1943, La Chambon wasn't just hiding refugees anymore. It was actively smuggling them out of France entirely. Guides, many of them, local teenagers, began leading groups of children across the mountains into neutral Switzerland. The journeys were brutal. 30 miles on foot through snow and ice, dodging border patrols, sleeping in caves. But hundreds made it, and Lyon became more than a sanctuary. It became a gateway to freedom. The Swiss border crossings were nightmares disguised as hope. The journey from last Chambon to the frontier took 3 days on foot through terrain that could kill you as easily as a German bullet. Guides, often barely older than the children they were leading, memorized patrol schedules, bribed border guards when possible, and relied on networks of sympathetic farmers who would hide groups in barns when patrols swept through. The children walked in single file, forbidden to speak, their shoes wrapped in cloth to muffle footsteps. If a child stumbled or cried out, the entire group could be compromised. And the Swiss, despite their official neutrality, were not guaranteed allies. Border guards often turned refugees back, sentencing them to arrest and deportation. But the guides from Liambal knew which crossings were porous, which guards looked the other way, and which mountain passes were unwatched at dawn. It was a deadly lottery. But for those who made it across, Switzerland meant survival. Back in the village, André Troc knew his time was running out. The Gestapo hadn't forgotten him. His refusal to cooperate, his open defiance had made him a target. In the summer of 1943, warnings reached him through resistance channels. An arrest order had been issued. He could flee, go into hiding, continue his work from the shadows. But leaving last Chambon would signal fear. It would embolden the authorities. It would tell the villagers that even their pastor, the man who had started this conspiracy, believed it was over. So, Trauma made a calculated gamble. He went into partial hiding, living in the village but moving between safe houses, never sleeping in the same place twice. It was a compromise between survival and symbolism. He remained visible enough to inspire, invisible enough to avoid capture. For months, it worked. But in August of 1943, the Gestapo sprang a trap. Officers surrounded the parsonage at dawn, expecting to find Trome asleep. Instead, they found his wife, Magda, calm and unflinching, serving breakfast to a group of refugee children. The officers demanded to know where her husband was. She told them the truth. She didn't know. They tore the house apart, searched every room, interrogated the children. Nothing. Furious, they arrested Magda instead, dragging her to the regional Gestapo headquarters in Lille. It was a hostage situation. The message was clear. Surrender yourself or your wife pays the price. And for the first time since the conspiracy began, André Trocme faced a choice that had no good answer. Turn himself in, and the network loses its leader. Stay hidden, and his wife could be tortured or killed. He turned himself in. Within hours, Trome walked into Gestapo headquarters and surrendered. He was immediately arrested along with his associate pastor Edo Teiche and the headmaster Roger Darcisac. The 3 men were thrown into a detention camp in Es-Paul-Dejo, a holding facility for political prisoners awaiting deportation to Germany. For the villagers of Le Chambon, it felt like the end. Their pastor, their moral compass was gone. The Gestapo had finally won. But here's what the Nazis didn't understand. Lignon was never dependent on one man. Trock had lit the fire, but the village had become the fuel. The network didn't collapse. It adapted. Magda Trockme, released after her husband's surrender, took over coordination. Other pastors stepped up. Farmers, teachers, and housewives who had been following orders now gave them. The conspiracy didn't just survive André's arrest, it accelerated. And then something extraordinary happened. International pressure began to mount. The arrest of 3 Protestant pastors for the crime of sheltering children became a propaganda disaster for Vichy. The World Council of Churches, neutral governments, even some Catholic bishops began raising their voices. The Vichy regime, already walking a tight rope between Nazi demands and maintaining a veneer of French sovereignty, realized they had made a mistake. Trom and his colleagues were too visible, too symbolic. Their execution or deportation would turn them into martyrs and ignite protests across unoccupied France. So after 5 weeks of detention, the 3 men were quietly released. No charges, no explanation, just a warning. Be more careful. They returned to Luchon as heroes, and the conspiracy, now unstoppable, roared into its final and most dangerous phase. By the winter of 1943, the entire plateau had transformed into a resistance fortress, disguised as pastoral farmland. What had started as a village conspiracy now stretched across dozens of communities. Lemazet, Sanvoy, Fino, Santa Greve, all became nodes in an underground railroad that funneled thousands of refugees towards safety. The Gestapo knew something was happening. They could feel it, but they couldn't see it. The network operated without written records, without radio communications, without anything that could be intercepted or traced. Orders were passed verbally. Safe houses changed weekly. And the most damning evidence, the children themselves hid in plain sight. Their false identities so deeply embedded into village life that even neighbors couldn't tell who was real and who was invented. It was counterintelligence by ordinary people who had never heard the term. The forger, Oskar Rosowski, had become a ghost legend. No one knew his real name. Most villagers had never seen his face, but his work circulated like underground currency. A farmer would receive a package containing 20 blank identity cards. A teacher would find baptism certificates slipped under her door. A family hiding refugees would wake up to discover freshly forged ration books on their kitchen table. Rosowski worked alone, trusting no one, moving between attics and barns, always one step ahead of the Gestapo sweeps that came with increasing frequency. He was 19 years old, and his forgeries were so perfect that after the war, French authorities would struggle to determine which documents were real and which were his creations. He saved lives with ink and paper, operating in shadows, never asking for recognition. And he almost got caught a dozen times. The children, now numbering in the thousands when you counted those in surrounding villages, developed their own survival culture. They created coded language for danger. A teacher writing a specific phrase on a blackboard meant raid coming, scatter. A church bell rung at an odd hour meant hide now. They established emergency rendezvous points in the forests marked with symbols only they understood. And they learned to read adults for signs of stress or fear, understanding that their survival depended on constant vigilance. Some of these children were as young as 4 years old, yet they carried the operational security of trained operatives. There are accounts of Gestapo officers interviewing children who maintained their cover stories under interrogation, with a composure that unnerved their interrogators. These weren't hardened resistance fighters. They were kids who understood that one mistake meant death for everyone they loved. The surrounding forest became a second village. Caves, abandoned shepherd huts, and dense thicket were transformed into emergency shelters stocked with blankets, canned food, and medical supplies. When raids intensified, entire groups of children would vanish into the woods for days, supervised by older teenagers or young adults who knew every trail and hiding spot. They learned to move silently through the trees, to recognize the sound of German vehicles from miles away, to sleep in shifts so someone was always watching. It was a parallel existence, half in civilization, half in wilderness, and the forests kept their secrets. Decades later, hikers would still discover remnants of these camps. Rusted cans, rotted blankets, childish carvings in tree bark marking safe paths. Physical evidence of an impossible survival. But the danger wasn't just from the Nazis. Informants were everywhere. Vichy loyalists, French collaborators, and ordinary people motivated by fear or greed could destroy the network with a single denunciation. And some tried. Anonymous letters arrived at Gestapo headquarters claiming specific farms were hiding Jews. Tips were called in to Vichy police. The network suffered losses. Families were arrested. Some children were caught during transfers and deported. But here's the remarkable part. The villagers never retaliated against suspected informants with violence. They isolated them socially, excluded them from the conspiracy, but refused to execute or harm them. Even in the darkest moments, Liambal maintained its pacifist principles. It was resistance without revenge, protection without violence. And somehow, impossibly, it kept working. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, and the Nazi occupation of France began its slow, violent collapse. But liberation didn't arrive everywhere at once. For Liambo and the plateau, the summer of '44 became the most dangerous period of the entire war. The Gestapo, sensing their time was running out, intensified their operations with desperate fury. SS units retreating from the advancing Allies swept through the region hunting for resistance fighters and Jews with a savagery born from impending defeat. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Hostages were executed in public squares, and Leon, with its 4-year record of defiance, sat squarely in the crosshairs. The conspiracy had survived the height of Nazi power. Now, it had to survive their death throes. On June 29th, exactly 3 weeks after D-Day, the Gestapo came for Daniel Traum. They had not forgotten the schoolmaster who had blocked a doorway and refused to surrender a Jewish child. Officers raided the Maison de Rose at dawn, dragged Daniel from his quarters, and arrested him along with 18 students, all of them Jewish. All of them betrayed by an informant whose identity remains unknown to this day. Daniel was transported to the Compiègne transit camp, then deported to the Mayonet concentration camp in occupied Poland. He never returned. On April 2, 1945, just weeks before the camp's liberation, Daniel Trauma died in the gas chambers. He was 31 years old. His final recorded words, according to a fellow prisoner who survived, were instructions to look after the children. Even in Majdanek, even facing death, he was still protecting them. The news of Daniel's arrest sent shockwaves through La Chambon. For the first time, the village felt the full weight of Nazi revenge. Parents who had entrusted their children to the network began to panic. Some demanded their children back. Others begged for them to be moved immediately to Switzerland. The carefully maintained calm that had held the conspiracy together for 4 years began to fracture. And then Magda Trauma did something that redefined courage. She called a meeting in the village square. She stood before hundreds of terrified people and told them the truth. Daniel was gone. The Gestapo was coming harder. The risks were now catastrophic. And then she said this: "We will not stop. We will not surrender a single child, and anyone who wants to leave the network can do so now with no judgment." She waited. No one moved. Not one person. The conspiracy held. August brought hell to the plateau. Half an SS unit fleeing American forces advancing from the south occupied the region and established brutal control. They executed suspected resistance members on sight. They burned farms suspected of hiding weapons, and they placed La Chambon under direct military surveillance. For 6 weeks, the village lived under occupation within occupation. SS troops patrolling streets, conducting house-to-house searches, interrogating anyone who looked suspicious. The children couldn't go to the forests anymore. The borders were sealed. Escape routes were cut off. They had to hide in the village itself in spaces so cramped and airless that some spent weeks in attics or cellars, never seeing daylight. It was the ultimate test of the network's ingenuity, and somehow impossibly not a single Jewish child was discovered during those 6 weeks. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A German officer named Sergeant Julius Schmaring, the same man who had led the failed raid in '43. Schmaring, now disillusioned and facing certain defeat, made a choice that still defies explanation. He began quietly warning the village when raids were planned. He falsified reports to his superiors, claiming searches had found nothing. And in late August, days before the SS unit retreated, he walked into the parsonage and told Magda Traum directly, "Get them out now. I can't protect you anymore." Why did he do it? Was it guilt, pragmatism, a last grasp at humanity before the end? No one knows. Schmaling disappeared after the war, never to be found. But his warning gave the network 48 hours, and in those 2 days, the village executed the largest evacuation of its entire operation, moving over 200 children to Switzerland in a single convoy. It was reckless, it was desperate, and it worked. September 1944, the SS units retreated eastward, blowing up bridges and railroads as they fled. American forces arrived on the plateau, and Luchon was finally officially liberated. The villagers poured into the streets, celebrating with a relief so profound it bordered on disbelief. They had done it. They had survived. But the celebration was muted, weighted by exhaustion and loss. Daniel Traume was gone. Dozens of villagers had been arrested, interrogated, beaten. Families had been torn apart. And the children, the 3,000 lives they had protected, were still there, still hidden, still afraid, because liberation didn't mean safety. Not yet. Many of the children had no homes to return to. Their parents had been deported, murdered in camps whose names they were only beginning to learn. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Soibor. The scale of the Holocaust was just emerging, and with it came a horrifying realization. The children of La Chambon were orphans, and the village that had hidden them now had to figure out what came next. Magda Traum refused to let them be shipped off to orphanages or displaced persons camps. She argued with a fierceness that shocked even the American relief workers that these children had already been uprooted too many times. They had been torn from their parents, stripped of their identities, forced to live as ghosts. They didn't need another institution. They needed stability. So she made an audacious proposal. Let the children stay in La Chambon. Let the families who had hidden them continue to care for them until relatives could be found or proper homes arranged. The American authorities were skeptical. How could a poor mountain village already stretched beyond capacity continue to feed and house hundreds of refugee children in the chaotic aftermath of war? But Magda didn't ask for permission. She simply continued doing what she had been doing for 4 years, and the village followed her lead. For months, Lachen became a strange, liminal place, part refugee camp, part village, part orphanage. Red Cross workers arrived documenting the children, searching for surviving relatives, trying to piece together shattered families. Some children were reunited with parents who had miraculously survived the camps. Those moments were devastating and joyous in equal measure. Skeletal mothers embracing children they hadn't seen in 3 years. Fathers weeping at the sight of sons and daughters they thought were dead. But for every reunion, there were 10 children who waited by the parsonage door, hoping for news that never came. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand that their parents were never coming back. The villagers who had risked everything to save these lives now had to help them grieve. Some children stayed in Lachen permanently. Families who had hidden them for years formally adopted them, raising them as their own. Protestant farmers became fathers to Jewish children, teaching them to tend sheep and plow fields. Teachers who had falsified records became surrogate mothers, helping traumatized kids rebuild their identities. And in one of the most remarkable acts of cultural preservation, the village made space for the children to reclaim their Jewishness. Synagogue services were held in the Protestant church. Jewish holidays were celebrated openly for the first time in 5 years. The villagers who had hidden these children by making them invisible now worked to make them whole again. It was a collective act of healing that lasted years and required a depth of compassion that defied measurement. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. What about justice? Who would be held accountable for the informants, the collaborators, the Vichy officials who had hunted these children? France was tearing itself apart in post-war purges, executing collaborators, shaving the heads of women who had slept with German soldiers, settling scores with mob violence. But La Chambon refused to participate. André Trocmé returned from his detention, and horrified by the executions he saw in other regions, preached forgiveness from his pulpit. He argued that vengeance would poison the very principles the village had fought to uphold. Some villagers disagreed. Some wanted names, trials, punishment. But the majority held firm. They had resisted with nonviolence. They would rebuild with nonviolence. It was a choice that haunted some survivors for the rest of their lives. But it was also a choice that allowed Las Chambon to remain Las Chambon, a place defined not by who it destroyed, but by who it saved. The world didn't want to hear about Liambang. Not at first. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the dominant narrative was one of heroic Allied armies and defeated Nazis. There was little appetite for stories about quiet villages that had simply done the right thing. France, eager to rebuild its national pride after the humiliation of occupation, focused on glorifying the armed resistance. The Machi fighters who had sabotaged railroads and assassinated German officers. Pacifist pastors who hid children didn't fit the narrative. They didn't storm beaches or blow up bridges. They just opened doors and lied to police. And so Le Chambon was ignored. No medals, no parades, no official recognition. The villagers returned to farming and teaching, and the children they had saved scattered across the world, carrying stories that no one wanted to publish. André Trocmé spent the rest of his life wrestling with what had happened. He never claimed to be a hero. In fact, he bristled at the word. In interviews decades later, he would insist that what Lambon did wasn't extraordinary. It was simply human decency in the face of inhuman evil. He refused to accept awards, turned down honorary titles, and became increasingly reclusive. The weight of Daniel's death haunted him. The knowledge that while he survived, his cousin had died protecting the same children created a guilt that never fully healed. Magda too struggled. She had nightmares for years. Dreams of Gestapo officers dragging children from her home. Dreams of trains departing for camps she couldn't stop. The trauma of living 4 years on the edge of catastrophe doesn't simply vanish with liberation. And for the Troms, like so many in the village, the silence that followed the war was almost as painful as the terror that had preceded it. It took nearly 40 years for the world to discover what Leon had done. In 1980, an American documentary filmmaker named Pierre Sauvage traveled to the village. Sauvage himself was one of the children saved by the network. Born in Luchemont in 1944 to Jewish parents who had found refuge there. He had grown up in America, knowing only fragments of his origin story. But as an adult, he became obsessed with a question. How had an entire village conspired to save lives when the rest of Europe looked away? His documentary, Weapons of the Spirit, finally brought Liambang's story to an international audience. And what Sauvage discovered shocked him. The villagers still didn't think they had done anything special. When he interviewed elderly farmers and teachers, they repeatedly said variations of the same thing. We just did what anyone would do. Except, of course, almost no one else did. The recognition, when it finally came, arrived in waves. In 1990, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, declared the entire village of Las Chambon righteous among the nations. The only time the honor has been bestowed on an entire community, rather than individuals. Survivors who had been hidden as children began returning to the plateau, now elderly themselves, searching for the families who had saved them. Tearful reunions happened on farmhouse doorsteps. Former refugee children, now professors, doctors, artists, embraced the now elderly farmers who had fed them scraps during the war. And the stories began to emerge in full. Not sanitized, not heroic, but real stories of fear, hunger, near misses, and impossible choices. Stories of ordinary people who simply refused to accept that genocide was inevitable. But even with recognition came questions that still haunt historians today. How did 3,000 people keep a secret for 4 years? How did an entire region conspire without a single catastrophic betrayal? The answer, frustratingly, is that no one knows for certain. There's no manual. No strategic plan was ever found. The conspiracy was oral, decentralized, and improvised. It succeeded because it had no leader to arrest, no headquarters to raid, no written records to seize. It succeeded because every single person chose individually to participate. And that choice, repeated thousands of times by thousands of people, created something the Nazis could never infiltrate. A culture of resistance so deeply embedded that it became indistinguishable from daily life. The village didn't hide children. The village became the hiding place. Today, Lyon looks like any other small French village. Stone houses cluster around a modest church. Farms dot the surrounding hills. Tourists pass through in summer, hiking the mountain trails, unaware they're walking paths that once served as escape routes for hunted children. But if you know where to look, the memory remains. A small museum documents the conspiracy. Plaques mark the homes of key figures. And every year on a cold morning in February, survivors and their descendants gather in the village square to remember. Some are in their 80s now, the last living witnesses to what happened here. They return to thank a place that saved their lives, and to ensure that the story doesn't die with them. Because Le Chambon's greatest fear isn't being forgotten by the world, it's being remembered as saints. The villagers never wanted to be exceptional. They wanted to be normal. And that's precisely what makes their story so devastating. Here's what the history books won't tell you. Laschen succeeded because it rejected the premise that there were only two choices during the Holocaust: collaborate or resist violently. The village found a third way: nonviolent defiance at scale. They didn't sabotage Nazi operations. They simply refused to participate in genocide. And that refusal, multiplied across an entire community, proved more effective than any bomb or bullet. It's a lesson that terrifies governments and inspires revolutionaries in equal measure. Because if one poor village in occupied France could save 3,000 lives without firing a shot, what does that say about every other place that claimed helplessness? What does it say about the millions who insisted they had no choice? Léon Bong proved that choice always exists. And that's a dangerous truth for those who profit from obedience. The children who survived Léonon carried the conspiracy into their own lives. They became teachers, doctors, activists, artists. Many dedicated their careers to human rights work, refugee advocacy, and Holocaust education. They married, had children of their own, and told their kids about the Protestant farmers who had hidden them in barns and taught them to milk cows. Those second-generation stories are now being passed to a third generation, grandchildren of survivors, who never met the villagers, but inherited their moral clarity. And in a world increasingly divided by nationalism, xenophobia, and the demonization of refugees, La Chambon's example has become more relevant, not less. Every time a government closes its borders to asylum seekers, every time a politician claims that protecting the vulnerable is too dangerous or too expensive, someone points to a small village on a French plateau and asks, if they could do it with nothing, why can't we? But here's the uncomfortable truth that survivors themselves will tell you. Lache Chambon was an anomaly. It shouldn't have worked. The odds of success were microscopic. One informant with a grudge. One Gestapo officer willing to massacre an entire village as an example. One logistical collapse, and the whole network would have crumbled. Thousands would have died, and the world would have never known their names. The villagers succeeded not because they had a perfect plan, but because they refused to abandon their principles even when failure seemed certain. That's not a strategy. It's a gamble. And most of the time throughout history, that gamble fails catastrophically. We remember Lyon because it's the exception. And we must remember the countless other places. The villages that tried to resist and were burned. The families that hid refugees and were executed. The networks that were betrayed and destroyed. Their courage was no less real. Their failure doesn't diminish their decency. But it does remind us that goodness doesn't guarantee survival. Sometimes evil wins. And yet, Le Chambon endures not as a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but as proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, some people refuse to let the darkness win. 3,000 children lived because 5,000 villagers decided that some lines cannot be crossed. No government ordered them to act, no army protected them. They simply saw children in danger and opened their doors. That's the story. That's the secret they hid in plain sight. And now you know why it was almost erased. Because it's a story that asks too much of us. It asks us to imagine what we would do if the knock came to our door. It asks whether we would risk everything for a stranger's child. and it refuses to let us believe that cowardice is ever the only option. Le Chambon didn't just save 3,000 lives. It saved the idea that ordinary people armed with nothing but conscience can stand against empires. And that idea, more than any monument or museum, is the true weapon of the spirit that still echoes across the plateau.